Pieter Willem Botha, DMS, commonly known as PW, and Die Groot Krokodil, was the leader of South Africa from 1978 to 1989, serving as the last Prime Minister from 1978 to 1984 and the first executive state president from 1984 to 1989. First elected to Parliament in 1948, Botha was an outspoken opponent of majority rule and international communism. However, his administration did make concessions towards political reform, whereas internal unrest saw widespread human rights abuses at the hands of the government. Botha resigned the leadership of the ruling National Party in February 1989 after suffering a stroke and 6 months later was coerced to leave the presidency as well. In F.W. de Klerk's 1992 referendum, Botha campaigned for a no vote and denounced de Klerk's administration as irresponsible by opening the door to black majority rule. In early 1998, when Botha refused to testify at the Mandela government's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he was supported by the right-wing Conservative Party, which had earlier contested his rule as the official opposition. For his refusal, he was fined and given a suspended jail sentence for crimes against human rights. Shortly before his death in late 2006, he renewed his opposition towards egalitarian democracy in favor of a confederate system based upon the principles of separate development. Early life: Pieter Willem Botha was born on a farm in the Paarl district of the Orange Free State province, the son of Afrikaner parents. His father, Pieter Willem Botha Sr., fought as a commando against the British in the Second Boer War. His mother, Hendrina Christina Botha, was interned in a British concentration camp during the war. Botha initially attended the Paarl School and matriculated from Vuurtrekker Secondary School in Bethlehem, South Africa. In 1934, he entered the Grey University College in Bloemfontein to study law, but left early at the age of 20 in order to pursue a career in politics. He began working for the National Party as a political organizer in the neighboring Cape Province. In the run-up to World War II, Botha joined the Oos-Brandwag, a right-wing Afrikaner nationalist group which was sympathetic to the German Nazi Party. However, with Allied victory looming in Europe, Botha condemned the Oos-Brandwag and changed his ideological allegiance to Christian nationalism instead. In 1943, Botha married Anna Elizabeth Rasool. The couple had 2 sons and 3 daughters. Parliamentary career: at age 30, Botha was elected head of the National Party Youth in 1946, and 2 years later won a race for the House of Assembly as representative of George in the Southern Cape Province in the general election which saw the beginning of the National Party's 46-year tenure in power. In 1958 Botha was appointed Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs by Hendrik Verwoerd, and in 1961 advanced to Minister of Coloured Affairs. He was appointed Minister for Defence by Verwoerd's successor B.J. Vorster, upon Verwoerd's murder, in 1966. Under his 14 years as its leader, the South African Defence Force reached a zenith, at times consuming 20% of the national budget, compared to 1.3% in 2009, and was involved in the South African Border War. When Vorster resigned following allegations of his involvement in the Muldergate scandal in 1978, Botha was elected as his successor by the National Party caucus, besting the electorate's favourite, 45-year-old Foreign Minister Pik Botha. In the final internal ballot, he beat Connie Mulder, the scandal's namesake, in a 78-72 vote. Though generally considered a conservative, Botha was also seen as far more pragmatic than his predecessor. He was keen to promote constitutional reform, and hoped to implement a form of federal system in South Africa that would allow for greater self-rule for black homelands, while still retaining the supremacy of a white central government, and foremost expand the rights of coloureds and Asians in order to widen support for the government. Upon enacting the reforms, he remarked in the House of Assembly, "We must adapt or die." On becoming head of the government, Botha retained the defence portfolio until October 1980, when he appointed Chief of the South African Defence Force, General Magnus Malan, his successor. From his ascension to the cabinet, Botha pursued an ambitious military policy designed to increase South Africa's military capability. He sought to improve relations with the West, especially the United States. but with mixed results. He argued that the preservation of the apartheid government, though unpopular, was crucial to stemming the tide of African communism, which had made inroads into neighboring Angola and Mozambique after these two former Portuguese colonies obtained independence. As Prime Minister and later State President, his greatest parliamentary opponents were Harry Schwartz and Helen Suzman of the Progressive Federal Party until 1987, when his former cabinet colleague Andries Trianite's new Conservative Party became the official opposition on a strictly anti-concessionist agenda. In 1977, as Minister of Defense he began a secret nuclear weapons program, which culminated in the production of 6 nuclear bombs destroyed only in the early 1990s. He remained steadfast in South Africa's administration of the neighboring territory Southwest Africa, particularly while there was a presence of Cuban troops in Angola to the north. Botha was responsible for introducing the notorious police counterinsurgency unit, COVOIT. He was also instrumental in building the South African Defence Force's strength, adding momentum to establishing units such as 32 Battalion. South African intervention in support of the rebel UNITA movement in the Angolan Civil War continued until the late 1980s, terminating with the Tripartite Accord. To maintain the nation's military strength, a very strict draft was implemented to enforce compulsory military service for white South African men. State President, in 1983 Botha proposed a new constitution, which was then put to a vote of the white population. Though it did not implement a federal system, it created 2 new Houses of Parliament alongside the existing, white-only House of Assembly, one for coloureds and one for Indians. The 3 chambers of the new tricameral parliament had sole jurisdiction over matters related to their respective communities. Legislation affecting general affairs, such as foreign policy and race relations, had to pass all 3 chambers after consideration by joint standing committees. The plan included no chamber or system of representation for the black majority. Each black ethno-linguistic group was allocated a homeland which would initially be a semi-autonomous area. However, blacks were legally considered citizens of the Bantustans, not of South Africa, and were expected to exercise their political rights there. Bantustans were expected to gradually move towards a greater state of independence with sovereign nation status being the final goal. During Botha's tenure Ciskei, Bophuthatswana and Venda all achieved nominal nationhood. These new countries set up within the borders of South Africa never gained international recognition. The new constitution also changed the executive branch, abolishing the post of Prime Minister. Instead, that post's powers were transferred to the state president, which was converted into an executive post with sweeping powers. He was elected by an electoral college whose members were elected by the 3 chambers of the parliament. The president and cabinet had sole jurisdiction over general affairs. Disputes between the 3 chambers regarding general affairs were resolved by the President's Council, composed of members from the 3 chambers and members directly appointed by the president. In practice, the composition of the President's Council and the Electoral College made it impossible for the colored and Indian chambers to outvote the white chamber even if they voted as a bloc. Thus, the real power remained in white hands and in practice, in the hands of Botha's National Party. Though the new constitution was criticized by the black majority for failing to grant them any formal role in government, many international commentators praised it as a first step in what was assumed to be a series of reforms. On September 14, 1984, Botha was elected as the first state president under the newly approved constitution. Implementing the presidential system was seen as a key step in consolidating Botha's personal power. In previous years he had succeeded in getting a number of strict laws that limited freedom of speech through parliament, and thus suppressed criticism of government decisions. In many Western countries, such as the United States, the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, there was much debate over the imposition of economic sanctions in order to weaken Botha and undermine the white regime. By the late 1980s as foreign investment in South Africa declined, disinvestment began to have a serious effect on the nation's economy. Apartheid government, in superficial ways, Botha's application of the apartheid system was less repressive than that of his predecessors. He legalized interracial marriage and miscegenation, both completely banned since the late 1940s. The constitutional prohibition on multiracial political parties was lifted. He also relaxed the Group Areas Act, which barred non-whites from living in certain areas. In 1988, a new law created open group areas, or racially mixed neighborhoods. But these neighborhoods had to receive a government permit, and had to have the support of the local whites immediately concerned, and had to be a high-class neighborhood in the major cities typically in order to receive the permit. In 1983, the above constitutional reforms granted limited political rights to coloreds and Indians. Botha also became the first South African government leader to authorize contacts with Nelson Mandela, the imprisoned leader of the African National Congress. However, in the face of rising discontent and violence, Botha refused to cede political power to blacks and imposed greater security measures against anti-apartheid activists. Botha also refused to negotiate with the ANC. In 1985, Botha delivered the Rubicon speech, which was a policy address in which he refused to give in to demands by the black population, including the release of Mandela. Botha's defiance of international opinion further isolated South Africa, leading to economic sanctions and a rapid decline in the value of the rand. The following year, when the U.S. introduced the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, Botha declared a nationwide state of emergency. He is famously quoted during this time as saying, "This uprising will bring out the beast in us." As economic and diplomatic actions against South Africa increased, civil unrest spread amongst the black population, supported by the ANC and neighboring black-majority governments. On May 16, 1986, Botha publicly warned neighboring states against engaging in unsolicited interference in South Africa's affairs. 4 days later, Botha ordered airstrikes against selected targets in Lusaka, Harare, and Gaborone, including the offices of exiled ANC activists. Botha charged that these raids were just a first installment, and showed that South Africa has the capacity and the will to break the African National Congress. In spite of the concessions made by Botha, the apartheid years under his leadership were by far the most brutal. Thousands were detained without trial during Botha's presidency, while others were tortured and killed. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission found Botha responsible for gross violations of human rights. He was also found to have directly authorized unlawful activity which included killing. However, Botha refused to apologize for apartheid. In a 2006 interview to mark his 90th birthday, he suggested that he had no regrets about the way he had run the country. He denied, however, that he had ever considered black South Africans to be in any way inferior to whites, but conceded that some whites did hold that view. He also claimed that the apartheid policies were inherited from the British colonial administration in the Eastern Cape and Natal Province, implying that he considered them something he and his government had followed by default. Resignation. State President Botha's loss of influence can be directly attributed to decisions taken at the Ronald Reagan-Mikhail Gorbachev summit of the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union in Moscow that paved the way to resolving the problem of Namibia which, according to Foreign Minister Pieter Botha, was destabilizing the region and seriously complicating the major issue which South Africa itself would shortly have to face. Soviet military aid would cease and Cuban troops be withdrawn from Angola as soon as South Africa complied with UN Security Council Resolution 435 by relinquishing control of Namibia and allowing UN-supervised elections there. The Tripartite Agreement, which gave effect to the Reagan-Gorbachev summit decisions, was signed at UN headquarters in New York on December 22, 1988 by representatives of Angola, Cuba and South Africa. On January 18, 1989, Botha suffered a mild stroke which prevented him from attending a meeting with Namibian political leaders on January 20, 1989. Botha's place was taken by acting President, J. Christian Hunes. On February 2, 1989, Botha resigned as leader of the National Party anticipating his nominee Finance Minister Baron du Plessis would succeed him. Instead, the NP's parliamentary caucus selected as leader Education Minister F. W. de Klerk, who moved quickly to consolidate his position within the party. In March 1989, the NP elected de Klerk as state president, but Botha refused to resign, saying in a television address that the constitution entitled him to remain in office until March 1990 and that he was even considering running for another 5-year term. Following a series of acrimonious meetings in Cape Town, and 5 days after UNSCR 435 was implemented in Namibia on April 1, 1989, Botha and de Klerk reached a compromise. Botha would retire after the parliamentary elections in September, allowing de Klerk to take over as president. However, Botha resigned from the state presidency abruptly on August 14, 1989, complaining that he had not been consulted by de Klerk over his scheduled visit to see President Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia. The ANC is enjoying the protection of President Kaunda and is planning insurgency activities against South Africa from Lusaka, Botha declared on nationwide television. He said he had asked the cabinet what reason he should give the public for abruptly leaving office. They replied I could use my health as an excuse. To this, I replied that I am not prepared to leave on a lie. It is evident to me that after all these years of my best efforts for the National Party and for the government of this country, as well as the security of our country, I am being ignored by ministers serving in my cabinet. De Klerk was sworn in as acting state president on August 14, 1989, and the following month was nominated by the Electoral College to succeed Botha in a 5-year term as state president. Within months of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, de Klerk had announced the legalization of anti-apartheid groups including the African National Congress and the release of Nelson Mandela. De Klerk's rule saw the dismantling of the apartheid system and negotiations that eventually led to South Africa's first racially inclusive democratic elections on April 27, 1994. In a statement on the death of former state president P.W. Botha in 2006, de Klerk said, "Personally, my relationship with P.W. Botha was often strained. I did not like his overbearing leadership style and was opposed to the intrusion of the State Security Council system into virtually every facet of government. After I became leader of the National Party in February 1989, I did my best to ensure that P.W. Botha would be able to end his term as president with full dignity and decorum. Unfortunately, this was not to be." Retirement: Botha and his wife Elise retired to their home, Die Anchor, in the town of Wilderness, close to the city of George and located on the Indian Ocean coast of the Western Cape. His wife Elise died in 1997, and he later married Barbara Robertson, a legal secretary 25 years his junior, on June 22, 1998. Botha remained largely out of sight of the media, and it was widely believed that he remained opposed to many of F.W. de Klerk's reforms. Botha refused to testify at the new government's Truth and Reconciliation Commission for exposing apartheid-era crimes, which was chaired by his cultural and political nemesis, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The TRC found that he had ordered the bombing of the South African Council of Churches headquarters in Johannesburg. In August 1998 he was fined and given a suspended jail sentence for his refusal to testify in relation to human rights violations and the violence sanctioned by the State Security Council, which he, as president until 1989, had directed. In June 1999 Botha successfully appealed to the High Court against his conviction and sentence. The court found that the notice served on Botha to appear before the commission was technically invalid. Death: Botha died of a heart attack at his home in Wilderness on Tuesday 31 October 2006, aged 90. His death was met with magnanimity by many of his former opponents. Former President Nelson Mandela was reported as saying, "While to many Mr. Botha will remain a symbol of apartheid, we also remember him for the steps he took to pave the way towards the eventual peacefully negotiated settlement in our country." President Thabo Mbeki announced that flags would be flown at half-staff, to mark the death of a former head of state. The offer of a state funeral was declined by Botha's family, and a private funeral was held on November 8 in the town of George where Botha was buried. Mbeki, who had lost a brother, a son and a cousin during apartheid, attended the funeral. References. Further reading: Botha's last interview before he died, The Mandela Document, dated prior to Mandela's release, Fighter and Reformer, extracts from the speeches of P.W. Botha, compiled by J. Sculls, published, Bureau for Information, Pretoria, 1989, The Life and Times of P.W. Botha IOL, P.W., Tambo Partners in Peace News 24, He Was My Bread and Botha Mail and Guardian, Zuma on P.W., He Saw the Need for Change Mail and Guardian, Thabo Mbeki on P.W. MoneyWeb.